Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Nice to see so many of you here this evening. I think it's a tribute to our speaker, Professor CARL HART, and the topic he's discussing, that so many have come out in all the conditions that have been around us for so long now. So thank you for being here at the Andre Mitchell Center. We're delighted to have with us today Professor CARL HART, who's a professor in the departments of psychology and psychiatry at Columbia University, where he specializes in behavioral neuroscience and neuropsychopharmacology. In recent years, Professor HART has emerged as a very influential voice in efforts to contest drug policy in the United States and around the world, drawing attention to what many feel is the abject failure of the war on drugs over the last 4 decades, and raising the issue of the injustice of so many people, hundreds of thousands, sitting in jail in the United States and elsewhere for nonviolent drug crimes. But I think part of what distinguishes Professor HART is that he goes beyond the perspective of many of his fellow travelers in calling into question certain pieties that tend to inform both sides of the conventional debate about drugs. For example, Professor HART calls into question the ease with which we assume that frequent drug users are automatically addicts. Not so, says Professor HART, based on clinical research that he often has conducted himself, and also on the basis of his personal experience. Likewise, and more fundamentally, Professor HART, again on the basis of clinical research and his personal experience, calls into question the assumption that drugs are simply bad, that drug use should be reduced, either by criminalizing it, or forcing people who are caught doing it to get medical treatment, or restricting it to medicinal uses. Professor HART suggests and argues on the basis of evidence, and again his personal narrative, that drug use for many people is not only not bad, but positively good. And throughout, yet another feature I think that informs the distinctiveness of Professor HART is that he injects his own personal story into the discussion. Especially in his recent book, Drug Use for Grownups, Professor HART discusses his own positive experiences using recreational drugs, and also describes his coming into awareness of his sense of social responsibility to come out of the closet about drug use, and in doing so, lend some further support to efforts to transform drug policies throughout the world. And so for all of these reasons, Professor HART's stature as a figure in debates about drugs today, the way in which he goes beyond the perspective of many of his fellow travelers in raising these fundamental questions about the potential value of drug use, for many people at least, and his courageous coming forward about his own personal background and experience with drugs. All of these features, I think, make him the most perfect figure to be here for our 10th edition of the Politics on the Edge lecture series. I want to thank the PHILOMATHEAN Society, who is our partner in the Politics on the Edge series. This is our 10th time, and they've been with us the entire time. I want to thank the students of the PHILOMATHEAN Society for all the work they've done to help make this event a reality, and especially the work of Cole Lewis and Nicholas Robeson. I'm going to give the mic over to Nicholas Robeson from Philo, and they're going to say a few words about their society, and then we'll turn things over to Professor HART. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Green. I just wanted to make a quick shout out to Philo. We're the oldest literary society in America, founded in 1813. We're located on the 4th floor of College Hall, and we host similar speaker events, teas, and debates, and we're looking for new members always. Thank you. Look forward to the talk.
Oh, check. Can we get some sound in the mic? There we go. Okay. Thank you all for coming out. I just want to ask a question before we get started. At Columbia, one of the things we do is the speaker unmask. I'm triple vaxxed, PCR recently, but I don't want to make anybody feel uncomfortable. And so I was going to take off my mask as I spoke, but if anyone's uncomfortable, please, it's cool. I won't do that. Are we good, or is that? Okay, all right, okay. just want to make sure that we're good and not have one of these arguments over nothing. So thank you all for coming out. I really appreciate it, particularly at this moment in our history. The title of my talk is Using Drugs to Contemplate Liberty. As Professor Green pointed out, it's a major topic in the new book, Drug Use for Grown-Up. The subtitle says, Chasing Liberty in the Land of Fear. One of the things that I had to think about as I was writing this book, I kept bumping up against this issue related to our original promise. The promise that we guarantee everyone these unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Meaning that basically you can live your life as you see fit, so long as you don't prevent others from enjoying these rights. Now, when I say that you can live your life as you see fit, there are some people in the country who think that, for example, like they can, for example, not be vaccinated and then interact in the broader community. That's more difficult. That's not what I'm talking about. That's like if I say I have the right to take a poop in the pool that everybody's using. I don't have that right because I will be impacting other people's liberties. So when I talk about liberty, I'm really talking about taking care of folks who are around me, and my rights don't supersede your rights. So I would just want to make sure we are all clear, given these inane arguments that are happening in the country now with COVID. And so I want to talk about something that's like really important, our happiness. And so in doing so, I just want to let you all know the agenda. In doing this, I have to think about how we as a country are not living up to our original promise, how our practice is inconsistent with the promise. And I want to show you this by first talking about some drug myths, drug realities, and then I want to talk about how we can make it right. Now, I only came to this position relatively recently. And I came to this position as I traveled around the world with my last book. And traveling around the world, learning from other cultures, other people, made me have to look at us as a country. Like being in places like Northern Ireland, and then seeing like white people catching hell for the same reasons that Black Americans are catching hell. Or in a place like the Philippines, those people catching hell like the poor people in Appalachia for the same reasons. And so that was a bit of a journey. And as one of my favorite authors has said when it comes to this sort of journey, it's like you can't know what you'll discover on the journey, what you will do with what you find, or what you find will do to you. That's me. That happened to me. I didn't know what would happen on this journey. This journey didn't just start with the last book. It started, as I think about it, when I graduated from high school. I graduated from high school in 1984, joined the military, learned a little something about liberty. So I have to show this military picture because in our country, it's okay for politicians, for example, to wear an American flag on their lapel, and then that's patriotic. That's not patriotic, that's bullshit. That's not patriotic. Patriotism is in the military. When you're in the military, one of the things that happens is that you give up your right. The Constitution doesn't apply to you. You are now governed by the Uniform Code of Military Justice. and you give up your rights in order to protect the rights of American citizens. That's patriotism. And so that's what I learned when I was in the military. I was a police officer for a time in the military. I carried an M16 for the country. And so I say that to let everyone know, like, my sort of American patriotic credentials are impeccable. And I just want you all to know that, because I will say some things that's harsh in terms of who we are as a country. And I just don't want some superficial jingoistic person to holler at me about patriotism. So I want you to know what time it is. There's another picture that's me at the NIH where I was doing my dissertation. Again, all the U.S. government supported. I got into the study of drugs in the late 1980s, the early 1990s. What was happening in the country was that we thought we were experiencing a crack epidemic. There never was a crack epidemic, but the country talks like it was. I mean, you hear this in movies, hip hop, all kinds of things. The use of crack was always relatively low, never rivaled anything near powder cocaine or marijuana, any of those drugs. But the country told us all, and I believe, by the way, that crack was destroying my community. And so I figured that one way I could participate and help was to study drugs, figure out what was happening in the brains of people who were addicted. And I thought that if I learned how to manipulate these neuronal mechanisms, I could help cure drug addiction, thereby helping to solve some of the problems in my community. That's the simple sort of reasoning that I entered graduate school with in my mind. Now, as we go through the talk, you'll see how my thinking about these things changed. In doing so, I have to talk about some of the drug myths, some of the myths that I held. One of the most important myths, as Jeff alluded to this in the introduction, actually Jeff gave my talk in the introduction, so. Addiction, this is one of the biggest drug myths. Addiction is inevitable and unpredictable. Now, before dealing with this myth, I need to explain to you all what I mean when I say drug addiction. I'm referring to the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association. This is the medical definition of addiction, the definition that we deal with. And there are 11 symptoms here. And an individual must endorse at least 2 of these symptoms in order to meet criteria for a mild substance use disorder. And if they endorse something like 6 or more, that's a severe substance use disorder. You can just look at some of the symptoms like craving, tolerance. The person spends a great deal of time in the activity necessary to obtain or use the substance. They have these persistent, unsuccessful attempts to cut back their use. So you can see the symptoms. A person has to endorse a certain amount in order to meet criteria for addiction. That's one component or one criteria. Another component is that the person also has to be distressed by these symptoms. So the person can simply endorse these symptoms but not be distressed. For example, you can imagine, I think it's like giving up important activities or important activities reduced because of your substance use. In this era, we can all imagine like going to something like Thanksgiving dinner. And then you have relatives like I do who support Trump. I gave up that activity of going to Thanksgiving dinner with them. And I might have used a substance. But I'm not distressed by that. That's okay. So you can see how you can endorse these symptoms but not actually meet criteria. So it's important that people understand, in order to make this diagnosis, the person has to be distressed by this. All right, now let's go back to this myth about drug addiction in terms of how many people or who is likely to become addicted. The facts are that 70 to 90% of the people who use drugs ranging from cannabis to heroin, 70 to 90% don't meet criteria for a substance use disorder. That is, the vast majority of people who use drugs don't meet criteria. This is inconsistent with what we have been taught and what we see in our media, in our movies, and so forth. The fact is, most people who use drugs are responsible members of our societies. They pay their taxes, they pay their bills, they take care of their families. In some cases, they even become president of the United States. All three of these men used drugs, illegal drugs when they were young men. Bill Clinton, marijuana, of course. George Bush, marijuana, widely suspected of using cocaine. Barack Obama acknowledges marijuana and cocaine use. And that's not to besmirch their reputation. It's just to show that responsible people who we look up to, use drugs. And we don't think of them in terms of being addicted. These folks, I mean, since all of them used cannabis, we might even say that cannabis is a gateway drug to the White House. No, that's illogical. But what does it say about these guys? So these guys say that they never used drugs. Point is you want to do well as a president, you have to have had some drug. No, that's not the point. That's not the point. The point is this: if the vast majority of people who use any drug, particular drug, don't become addicted, then we can't blame the drug for drug addiction, as we do. So the question becomes, if we can't blame drugs, then what can we blame? What is the problem? Well, the problems are the same problems that we have known forever. We know that co-occurring illnesses like mental problems, depression, anxiety, or even physical problems like a pain disorder or poverty, whether it's economic or educational, lack of skills, all of these sort of things increase the likelihood that someone might meet criteria for substance use disorder. Also, if you subject people to chronic, unrealistic expectations, you can think about the young celebrity who has been charged with taking care of his entire family for some period of time, and they're not doing as well in their profession. You can think about these kind of unrealistic expectations that we place on some people in our society. You can think about other reasons, particularly now that we're in this COVID sort of situation. You can think about people who feel lonely, hopelessness. The way the country feels today is different than it used to feel. All of those things play an important role in determining who might meet criteria for substance use disorder. A lot more so than the drug itself. But those issues that I just delineated, they're a lot more complicated than simply telling your constituents you're going to rid the community of cocaine or heroin or fentanyl or something of that nature. It's a lot easier to simply tell people that you're going to put more cops on the streets to get rid of these drugs, as opposed to saying, I'm going to make sure everyone's gainfully employed. I'm going to make sure that we have a healthy, thriving community. It's a lot more, that's more complicated than saying that you're going to go after drugs in your community. That's one of the reasons that we have focused on the drugs. Another myth that I like to talk about is this issue related to the brain. Addiction is a brain disease. That's one of the sort of more prominent myths today. And this myth has its sort of origins in a paper written by then director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, Alan Leshner, in 1997 when he wrote this piece called Addiction is a Brain Disease and It Matters. That addiction is tied to changes in brain structure and function is what makes it fundamentally a brain disease. That's what Alan Leshner said, even though in this editorial he had absolutely no data, certainly in humans, supporting this position. And this was published in one of our premier science journals. It was published in Science. But there's no data to support these claims. And so this sort of thinking has, it's so pervasive now in our sort of science that it's even in the DSM-5 in terms. Now, the DSM-5 is how we determine whether someone meets criteria for a substance use disorder. The DSM-5, the current edition, says an important characteristic of substance use disorders is an underlying change in brain circuits that may persist beyond detoxification, particularly in individuals with severe disorders. Now, this is very important because if you don't really follow the field, this might be too subtle to catch. It says that an important characteristic of a substance use disorder is an underlying change in brain circuits. Now, in order to determine whether someone has a change in their brain circuits, you have to do something like image them before they meet criteria for a substance use disorder. Maybe you catch them when they are children or something of that nature. Maybe you catch them at some point in their adolescence. And so the point is that this is an impossible thing to determine, but yet it's in the DSM. Okay, now when I think about a brain disease, I think of things like Huntington's disease or Parkinson's disease. So when you think about those diseases, it's important for us to know that these diseases are progressive, irreversible, and fatal. And you can also look in portions of the brain, the striatal area, and see atrophy that will progress through the clinical manifestation of the disorder. Now, when you think about something like substance use disorder, most patients recover without any medical treatment, and there is no comparable neural correlates. So it's not irreversible, it's not fatal typically. And so when I think about brain disease and then this notion that drug addiction is a brain disease, it's a theory that's in search of data. There are no data in humans to support this position. One of the things I did back in 2012 was I published a paper looking at people who met criteria for a methamphetamine use disorder. And I looked at all of the papers that included neuroimaging and some cognitive testing in these studies. Now, I looked at methamphetamine users because methamphetamine is a drug, amphetamines in general. This class of drugs can cause some neurotoxicity at large doses, at doses that are 10, 20 times what humans normally take. But if you're going to see some toxicity, you would see it with amphetamines, more so than something like cocaine. More so than something like heroin. You would see neurotoxicity with the amphetamines more readily. And so I decided to look at the papers that included neuroimaging measures and cognitive measures and do a critical review of all of this literature. What I determined was that the cognitive functioning of the participants, people who met criteria for methamphetamine use disorder, their cognitive performance was normal. And the sort of any brain differences, what we saw was that it was interpreted as pathology, even though it was likely just within the normal range of variability. Like some people are short, some people are tall, but we don't go around calling short people height deficient or some other sort of pathological term related to being short. Instead, we just say that there is variation. But when we look at this literature, any difference is interpreted as pathology, even though the folks are performing in the normal range when it comes to cognitive performance. Now, so when I think about the methamphetamine users, they are normal. And then I think about some of the studies we've done with people who, for example, who meet criteria for crack use disorder or crack addiction, as they say. One of the things that I was told when I first started studying people who use crack was that, okay, these folks will, if you give them an opportunity to take crack, they'll take that every opportunity, no matter what, because the addiction is so strong. So one of the early studies we did was that we brought people into the lab, people who met criteria for crack addiction, offered them a choice between a nice hit of crack and $5 in cash. We offered them multiple choices, a number of choices, and what we determined was that when you give people a choice between $5 and a hit of crack, they take drug and money on about the same occasions. Now, when you increase the amount of money, they take money like almost all the time. We showed this with other drugs, like with methamphetamine. In this study, when you increase the money to as much as $20 or so, they choose money almost on nearly every occasion. The bottom line is that drug-taking behavior is governed by the same principles of other behaviors. And drug users can and do behave rationally. This is what we see over and over in the lab. And some people say, well, maybe they just simply took your money, and then when they left your lab, they went out and bought drugs. Maybe they did that. But if they did that, it shows that they can inhibit inhibitory control, which is an executive cognitive function that we said they didn't have. And so in either case, the data showed that these folks are behaving as rationally as other folks. Now, so as I've gone through my career, and thinking about these data and other data, I have to ask the question like, well, why do we consistently emphasize the negative effects or exaggerate the harmful effects? Why do we do that? Just as researchers, we participate in this sort of thing. Now, I should say, some people may be just simply erring on the side of caution because they just don't want to give anyone the impression that they should be using drugs. So that could be some people. That means that those sets of researchers who do that, then they don't have to think about the complexities of life. And so they don't think about the consequences of that behavior, but that's okay. There might be those people. But I think what's happening mostly is that people overemphasize the negative effects because it enhances the significance of their research. You know, when I think about funding in this area, 90% of the world's funding in this area is through the National Institute on drug abuse. And their mission had been to focus primarily on these negative effects because it's in the NIH, and NIH focuses on pathology. And so I think Upton Sinclair said it best about this situation when, well, he was speaking of something else, but I think his words are important for this situation when he said it's difficult to get a man, and in this case a woman too, because Nora Volkow is the current director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, but it's difficult to get a man or a woman to understand something when his or her salary depends upon his or her not understanding it. And that's the sort of situation that we have with funding in the area of substance use and substance abuse. People are incentivized to exaggerate the harmful effects. Now, doing this sort of thing has some real consequences. The consequences are as follows. It allows authorities to scapegoat drugs in order not to deal with the real problems that people face, like poor people who may not be gainfully employed. We can say we're going to go after drugs. We're going to build more prisons, as opposed to really dealing with people's problems. And it also allows authorities to target people that we don't like without explicitly saying we don't like those people. So the history of our sort of drug policy is that drug policy has been based primarily on our dislike of certain groups. I'll talk about that in a bit, but those are real consequences. And when we think about a specific example, I think about the Philippines and their president, Duterte, when he said that a year or more use of methamphetamine would shrink a person's brain, and therefore the person is not viable for rehabilitation. And Duterte has killed thousands of people who were suspected of using or selling methamphetamine. And he feels that he's justified because methamphetamine shrinks your brain. It causes a brain disease. This is his thinking. Never mind, Duterte has said how much he likes drugs like fentanyl. I mean, he says these things publicly. He likes it for their subjective effects. But he thinks that people who use methamphetamine are a different type and they're okay to be killed. Another consequence of our current approach is that it's damn near impossible now for chronic pain patients to obtain opioids because of our vilification of that class of drugs. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But it's difficult for people who've been maintained on opioid medications for 10, 20 years and safely maintained and their pain problem being treated. They are now having problems getting opioid pain medications. And we're seeing increased suicide in that group of people because of our vilification of opioids. Opioids are important medicines and they are useful and they are beneficial for a large number of people. But it's almost impossible to get physicians to prescribe them to people now. Other sort of beneficiaries of this sort of approach that we've had in our country, I alluded to law enforcement and prison authorities. Some of you all might be aware, around the country, people are trying to close prisons. California, New York, and the communities in which those prisons reside are fighting back. They want to keep these prisons open because these prisons are jobs. And these prisons oftentimes are the biggest employers in those towns. And so you can see how our focus on drugs, the war on drugs, fills these prisons. And so they want to see more people going to prison. Other people who benefited, so-called drug treatment centers. These drug treatment centers, many of them are religious in tone and don't know anything about medicine or drugs, but they call themselves drug treatments. I can think about the media. Anything we ever watch related to drugs. Oh, we're in Philly, so I have to say something about Bill Cosby. All right. Since we're in Philly, there's a new documentary out called, I think, Camus Bell. It's called We Need to Talk About Bill Cosby. This is the media kind of thing. So on the one hand, Bill Cosby has, I think it's been demonstrated that he gave people sedatives without their knowledge. Sedatives are drugs that make you less lucid, sleepy. We can think of them sometimes as date rape drugs, but they really are used for anxiety and to decrease anxiety. So Bill Cosby, I think it's been demonstrated, has given sedatives to people without their knowledge. And in his comedy routine in the 70s, maybe 80s, he talked about Spanish flies. Spanish flies is this sort of thing that we think of as an aphrodisiac. not the same thing as a sedative. An aphrodisiac helps people to enjoy sex more. And so typically the person is having a better time than someone who has a sedative and unaware that they're being insulted or assaulted. But in this documentary film, the filmmaker conflates the two like they're the same thing. Drugs are bad, and Bill Cosby's bad. This is not a commentary on Bill Cosby, this is a commentary on us. How we are allowed to be stupid with drugs when we are speaking about drugs in the public or in these documentary films. We can think about the movie Dope Sick, all of these things. They're awful, and they're not grounded in evidence, or they're not reality based. But we as a public, we accept that, and it's okay. And journalists, they don't have to know much about drugs to be writing about drugs, and we accept it. We can think about drug testing outfits, like when you're urine testing, those people make a lot of money from this sort of current arrangement that we have. So a number of people are invested in this sort of war on drugs. And so when we say things like the war on drugs has been a miserable failure, that's not true. The war on drugs has been a boom. Many people made a lot of money and currently are making a lot of money. In fact, the war on drugs is one of the most successful jobs programs that we've had in the United States. That's the real sort of purpose of the war on drugs. The problem is that the war on drugs is predicated on subjugating poor and ethnic minorities, bodies of those folks. Those people are paying the price. That's the problem. Meanwhile, a number of other people are making money. And so the war on drugs has been a success. Failures don't continue for as long as this thing has continued. So please understand it's been a success. Now, another sort of myth is that poor people are the primary users of drugs. I mean, this is one of the most silly things that we have in our minds and our collective conscience in this country. Now, we understand that the illicit drug trade is a multi-billion-dollar industry. People are getting paid. We know that. When we want to go after El Chapo or those kind of people, we let the public know how much money is involved. Poor people don't have that kind of money to support an industry that makes that kind of money. The vast majority of drug users are middle to upper class people. I wrote about it partly in my book, Traveling Around the World, getting high with all of these people who are captains of industry. So it's really a simple sort of thing. So don't fall for the notion that poor people are the ones that are using drugs. They're just the ones who are going to jail. Another myth is that opioids cause the opioid crises. This is, in the new book, I was really trying to talk about happiness, pleasure. I was trying to communicate to the reader how happy I am to be alive in this moment. I wrote the book before COVID. And I was trying to communicate to the reader the joys of some drug use, done responsibly and how to do it. Just trying to communicate to the reader how I have grown as a person as a result of some of my drug activities. Trying to communicate this to the reader. And every time I was submitting things to my publisher or my editor, I kept getting asked questions about the opioid crises. I kept having to deal with the opioid crises. Now, the opioid crises, one of the things that has allowed it to continue is the conflating of what we're talking about. So when I just want to break it down what I'm talking about. When I say opioid crises, I am not talking about addiction rates, because when we think about addiction to, for example, people who may be prescribed these medications, less than 1% to maybe 10% at most of people who are prescribed those meds will become addicted, and the vast majority of people who use even heroin do not become addicted. So I'm not talking about addiction. Addiction rates haven't changed that much. What I'm talking about is what we're calling overdoses, drug overdoses. So I was having to deal with this issue about overdoses because as I was writing in the book, some of the beneficial effects of opioids. My editor would say, well, you know, somebody's going to say, how can you be talking about heroin in these positive terms when people are dying from heroin, for example? That's what, so I had to continuously address this issue. Now, when I think about how we count drug overdoses, it's important for us to understand that death investigations are done primarily in the United States by two groups of people: medical examiners and coroners. Medical examiners are people who have a medical degree and some postgraduate training in forensic pathology. Coroners are typically people who just have a high school diploma and they are registered to vote and they are elected. So most of the jurisdictions in the United States rely on coroners to do their death investigations. And so what happens with these sort of death investigations and the death certificates, they all are submitted to the CDC, who compiles what's happening in terms of drug-related deaths and other types of deaths. And so you can imagine, across the country, thousands of different people are filling out these death certificates, and they have a wide range of expertise. And so you can see how that might be a problem. And then you add into this issue the fact that many of the jurisdictions don't consistently test for drugs or specific drugs or drug levels, and so you don't really know what actually caused the death. And then you add on top of that, most of these drug-related deaths, in most of these cases, the individual had multiple drugs in their system. And so you don't know which drug actually is responsible, or you don't even know if a drug is responsible for the death. And so we really don't know. That's why we say drug-related death. But it gets translated into the newspaper as an opioid death, even though many of these deaths don't involve opioids. Some of them, the person had an opioid in their system, but we don't know whether or not the opioid actually was the culprit. I'll just share I sometimes get toxicology. The family members may send me a toxicology and ask me for my opinion, or some documentary filmmaker may send me the toxicology. But I'll just give you an example. There was a documentary filmmaker making a film about Whitney Houston. And this person wanted to say that Whitney Houston died from crack cocaine. That's what this filmmaker wanted to say. And so I know that it's difficult to die from cocaine, but the public thinks that it's not. And so I asked the person to send me to toxicology because he wanted me to be in the film and I wanted to see the toxicology. So I looked at the toxicology. And the autopsy's up there. Whitney Houston fell asleep in the tub and drowned. That's how she died. She had in her system cocaine, cocaethylene, Xanax, and antihistamine, and she probably had alcohol, but they didn't test for alcohol. It wasn't listed, but she had this thing called cocaethylene, meaning that she would have had alcohol in her system. But then you look at the death certificate, it says she drowned, but then another, the sort of a secondary cause was cocaine use. Now, anybody who knows anything about cocaine knows that cocaine is a stimulant. It would keep you up. So if anything, maybe more cocaine would have kept her awake, not put her to sleep, and so she drowned. But the point is that it's a lot more sexy to say cocaine use, even in the case when someone drowns. I mean, so if you start to go through these death certificates or toxicologies and autopsies, you start to see a lot of problems what's going on in the country. Now, added to this, as I pointed out, there are multiple drugs involved, and we don't consistently test for alcohol. And then we think about things like there are cases where people get tainted drugs, like fentanyl. The country has been educated about fentanyl. Fentanyl is a medication that is FDA approved to treat severe pain, but the way we talk about it in the country is that it's a medication that's only used to kill people. But fentanyl comes in lollipop formulations that we give it to children, and it's a safe medication if the person understands that they have fentanyl. But fentanyl is a lot more potent than something like heroin, meaning that less of it is required in order to produce an effect, including respiratory depression. So if the person doesn't know that they have fentanyl, then that can be a problem. And there are people who take a drug that they think is heroin and it actually contains fentanyl, and that person could be in trouble and might might be subjected to respiratory depression and die. That's a real possibility. But there's an easy fix. We can do like they do in places like Spain, the Netherlands, Austria, Colombia. We can implement these drug checking facilities where people can simply submit small samples of their drugs and get a chemical printout of everything that's contained in the substance and also what percentage of that substance is in that that submitted substance. So it's an easy fix, but in the United States, we haven't done that. But yet we say that we're concerned about people who are dying from what we're calling opioid-related deaths. Another drug myth, and I'm going to wrap up here shortly, is that psychedelics are unique. Psychedelics are drugs like LSD, ayahuasca, psilocybin, ketamine. Now, certain people are enthusiastic about these drugs, thinking that these drugs are different from other drugs like cocaine or heroin and these kinds of things. On this slide, I just simply want to point out that this is PCP on the left and ketamine on the right. PCP and ketamine are chemical cousins. Ketamine is made from PCP. Ketamine is an FDA-approved medication now to treat depression. PCP, of course, has this reputation of being this drug that when people take it, they develop superhuman strength, they become uncontrollable, and the police have to shoot them 26 times, 36 times in order to subdue them. That's the reputation that PCP has, and when in fact it produces effects that are similar to ketamine. So, but they have wildly different reputations. And so the people who are into psychedelics are not embracing PCP because of this reputation, and the people with whom the PCP is associated with. Since we are here today, I have to just remind you all of a killing that happened back in October 2014 in Chicago. Laquan McDonald's young 16-year-old kid was shot 16 times by the Chicago police. And the shooting was originally justified because the police said that Laquan McDonald had PCP in his system. And the idea was he was out of control and he had to be shot 16 times. And the public, they bought it because it was PCP. And then so when the video was released, by the way, this is a bit gruesome, but this is the actual video. When the video was released, you can see Laquan McDonald was not lunging at the police, walking away from the police, but he was shot 16 times. But PCP was evoked because we knew the public they knew the public would not ask many questions. And this video didn't come out until a year later, when some dogged journalists finally got the city of Chicago to release the video. I showed this video today because the cop, Jason Van Dyke, who shot Laquan McDonald, got 99 years. The jury gave him 99 years. The judge cut it down to just under 7 years. So the judge overturned the jury sort of verdict. And I'm not arguing that we should be increasing people's sentences. This is just a fact. So the cop got just under 7 years, and he got out today after serving 3 years. And so the point is that but Jason Van Dyke, the police officer, is not the only one who's benefited from this PCP defense. There's a woman in Tulsa, Oklahoma, who was a cop, Betty Jo Shelby. She shot Terrence Crutcher and killed him and did serve no time. Some of y'all who are old enough to remember Rodney King, the police said that they beat him because they thought he was on PCP. Again, PCP is a psychedelic, but it's not embraced by that community because of this social context. Now, there are other psychedelics or drugs that this community embraces as a psychedelic, like MDMA, which is methylene dioxymethamphetamine. MDMA, Molly, is really an amphetamine. It's nearly identical to methamphetamine, and they produce a lot of overlapping effects. But the community, the psychedelic community, embraces MDMA, but not methamphetamine. Just trying to show how arbitrary this stuff can be. Now when we think about the drug realities, I'm going to move to drug realities. The fact is, drug use is an overwhelmingly positive and life-enhancing activity. That's a fact. We give drugs as part of our research, and I've been doing this for nearly 25 years now, and we have seen primarily positive effects, whether they're medical, something like cannabis. Cannabis, we've shown things like it enhances food intake in people who may be HIV positive and experiencing AIDS wasting. We can think about the amphetamines, like methamphetamines. Some of our military personnel uses amphetamine to stay awake, to be alert, particularly doing long missions. Other drug realities, this is an important one. Our current drug policies they've been motivated by racism and classism and not pharmacology. Just briefly, all of this is in the book, but just briefly. Our first drug laws, we passed our first national drug laws in 1914. And these drug laws were motivated primarily by the fact that many of our citizens, white citizens, were concerned about black people, black men using cocaine. As this article says, Negro cocaine fiends are a new Southern menace. In the article, this guy, Dr. Williams, argues that cocaine use made black men better marksmen, more murderous, and impervious to .32 caliber bullets. Southern police forces had to move away from the .32 caliber weapon to the .38 caliber weapon in order to deal with these mythical cocainized black people. And we passed our first drug laws about the same time. Every subsequent drug law has been motivated by our dislike of some specific group, and not by pharmacology. Cocaine is not banned because of its pharmacology. Cocaine is banned because of its association with poor black people. By the way, I just want to make this clear. It wasn't only the white dominant culture or structure that participated in the vilification of cocaine used by black people. It was also black people. They participated in this sort of thing, this sort of issue of politics of respectability. Respectable black people would say, that's not me, that's those people. The same is true even today. And so when we think about these drug laws, it's not only white Americans, it's black Americans, it's not only Republicans, it's Democrats. They all participate in this sort of vilification or this vilifying of certain groups and certain drugs. And so it's not just one. Another reality is that our drug policies is just inconsistent with our promise. As I pointed out earlier, we say that people have the right to enjoy life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Why did drugs become an exception in that? If you're not bothering anyone, you're minding your own business, you're enjoying yourself, you're happy. If you're happy, you're more likely to treat other people better. What's wrong with that? How did we sacrifice that right? Why did we sacrifice that right? That's the question. But how can we make it better? Well, some of our states have shown that with cannabis, we can make it better by regulating the sale and use of cannabis for adults. This would generate numerous jobs, millions in revenues, like is happening with cannabis. We can do the same thing with these other drugs. We can talk about that as well for people who have concerns about that. But what it would do is that it will begin to reconcile our inglorious past practices with our promise of this issue of liberty. But I recognize that we have a lot of pearl-clutching Americans who will be horrified at this sort of thing. And so I am offering some intermediary steps. One intermediary steps is that we can stop arresting people for using drugs, just full decriminalization like the state of Oregon has done. Oregon has said, the state of Oregon passed a law that said they will not be arresting anyone for using drugs. Of course, drug sales remain illegal, and you still run the risk of getting tainted drugs. But at the least, people are not going to jail for simply possessing drugs that they're using. And we can also have these drug checking services where people can have their drugs tested to make sure that they don't have adulterants that are potentially dangerous. And we have to do a better job of having more realistic education about drugs and this nonsense of drugs are only bad. We have to grow up. We have to do a better job, and we have to be more realistic. We have to understand that there are millions of people in our society who are using drugs, but they're in the closet, and they're just not telling you. And in some cases, they're better people for it. We've recently had a resurgence of sort of interest in James Baldwin. The country is, we do in this country, we like to take only certain words of the people that we have now made martyrs or saints, and we do that with James Baldwin as well. But I just want to remind everybody, particularly Baldwin fans, in 1986 when we passed these harsh laws about crack, Baldwin was speaking before the press club in D.C., and he was arguing for legalizing drugs in 1986. But nobody seems to remember that, and no one seems to mention that. And this is just a clip of Baldwin saying this.
How we want to get to the heart of the dope problem, legalize it. That destroys the profit motive and may save our children. Nobody who has a habit who can afford it is going to go to jail. So it's a law which in operation can be used only against the poor. A law like that is a bad law. And it's not stopped anybody from its fix. We just put some people in jail and some people under the ground because a whole lot of money being made on the anti-dope law, which does not work. That is one of the things I think a black politician might suggest to white politicians, if you see what I mean.
1986. So what I'm saying is nothing new, but it's just been ignored, and I expect they will ignore me too. But with that, I like to open it up for questions. And thank you for your time. Please, the middle here? Yes, please.
Oh, okay. Thank you for a lovely presentation. I just wanted to. Wait, okay. Thank you for a lovely presentation. I have a question on whether you've been following what's going on with Amazon and their support for the legalization of marijuana and like certain bills, and whether you have an opinion on it.
I haven't followed only at a superficial level. Can you say more? Like what are you thinking?
Basically, a rough summary is that Amazon would like to lead the charge in legalizing marijuana. There's certain acts that they've supported, like the MORE Act, which has been put forth by some Republicans. You know, short summary.
Yeah, it's not surprising because it's a lot of money to be made in legalizing cannabis, and I mean from security to the actual products. I mean because many of these states that have legalized cannabis, you have to have this big security apparatus. So the cops are still going to get paid. They still have their hand in the cookie jar. Everybody will make money, and so I'm not surprised. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you.
Big fan. So my name's Kelly. I work in the neuropsychiatry department. So I do some cognitive exams. I'm very interested in that impact. So I know that over time our understanding of drugs and our view of different drugs has been very malleable. Back in the early 1900s, a lot of people were using opiates in lozenges, including housewives to clean the house and to just get more enjoyment out of their basic chores. And then in 1909, we had the 1909 Smoking Opium Exclusion Act, which imprisoned many Chinese immigrants for the specific modality of smoking opium instead of taking it via lozenge form. And over time, our understanding of opiates has changed. It's become more pharmacological. But now, I see that there are even recent changes. I mean, with nicotine is a good one. It was down in use for a while, and now it's back up. As a lot of some of the other chemicals in cigarettes kind of go away. I just wonder what you think that the role of an individual can be in this state where we can, is it just coming out of the psychedelic closet? Is it just trying to speak and lessen the stigma with these drugs, or is it just voting? Like, what do you think is the best approach for an individual?
Yeah, so you said a lot there. You alluded to the opium, banning of the opium, sort of the Chinese Exclusion Act. That one. So one of the reasons that we regulated the opium dens were because what happened was a lot of Chinese folks came over to the U.S. to help build the railroads and so forth, and with some of them brought with them the habit of smoking opium, and then some. They opened opium den shops, and these shops were successful, very successful in some places like San Francisco. That upset many of the white power structure, and so places like San Francisco started passing laws as early as 1875, banning white people from going into the Chinese opium dens, eventually causing those shops to go out of business in some cases. New York did a similar thing. A number of these places did that kind of thing. And then that caused the federal government, that we had some problems with the Chinese sort of government. And then in 1909, we were saying that we were going to reconcile our problem with China by having sort of international treaties on opium products because the British forced opium on the Chinese, and so we said we're going to be on your side. We're going to have these international treaties, but in the U.S. Congress didn't pass the law, and then that's when they included black people into the law in 1914. That's when that law got passed in 1914. Now, when you think about like, what does this mean for the individual in the U.S.? What it means is that I just want people to simply think about the Declaration of Independence in a real serious way. In that, why do you care what other people are doing as long as they're not bothering people and they're adults and so forth? And why not stand up on their behalf, even if they're using drugs, or we besmirch people as crackheads or whatever, all of those negative terms, we have to say something. When we see these one-dimensional sort of portrayals in our movies of people who use drugs or sell drugs. I mean, you can just think about any movie you see that has drugs or a drug dealer in it. The writer, the director, they don't have to develop that character. That character, we just know they're bad. Nothing in life works like that. So all of these kind of things we have to call out. And then, yeah, we have to get out of the closet. And you get out of the closet on behalf of people who are suffering and who don't have that luxury because they already been identified and they are catching hell. They may have their children taken away, or they may have some other consequences that they're paying. Oftentimes I hear people say things like, well, there might be a price for me to pay if I get out of the closet. I don't know when there was a time that anybody was fighting for some freedom that there wasn't a price to pay. And so these same people have as their heroes people like Martin Luther King, Fannie Lou Hamer. All those people paid dearly. And so, with getting out of the closet is an important thing, and standing up for the rights of other people. And calling out politicians who wear lapel pins and talk about their patriotic. That's not patriotism. I think all of those things are important in this discussion. And you're in science. Oh, you don't have to look far, because science has really screwed this up. Well, not science, scientists. I want to make that clear. And so you want to make sure you call out our community. They don't have to deal with the consequences of our practice or these policies. But there are a number of people in our society who do. Please, you guys have the mics.
Hi, I just want to say thank you for the talk, first of all. You mentioned how in the media drugs have not been portrayed properly. I wanted to know if you have any recommendations for media, whether it be books, movies, television, that you feel do a good job portraying drugs in a more realistic sense.
Oh, God. Have you heard of a book called Drug Use for Grownups? You can start there. It's a real tricky thing because there's a guy in England, he's a scientist and he's well respected. His name is David Nutt. He does a really good job with drugs on this topic. I like his writings on it. So things that David Nutt is involved with typically are really good. And beyond that, it's really hard to say, even though I like a lot of folks. But oftentimes people who are in this space revert back to addiction. And addiction is a minority of these effects. And addiction it's always talked about in this conversation. It would be like if you're interested in cars and the only thing that people talk about are car crashes. And you want to know the latest BMW model or something, and they want to talk about car crashes. That's what happens with drugs, and so you have to be careful that they don't take you down the addiction frame.
Hey, thank you so much. I love this talk, and there are a lot of harm reduction folks in the audience tonight. Many of us associated with Prevention Point Philadelphia, the country's largest syringe exchange and multi-service public health organization. And at the risk of sounding like an idiot here, I can't really formulate the question, but it's a sense that, man, oh man, I agree with you in just all this stuff. But at the same time, I have trouble reconciling some of what you were saying with, and we were all talking about this, with the incredible suffering that we're seeing on the streets right now from heroin and fentanyl. And, pardon? Yeah. And I've been doing it 26 years now, San Francisco and here in Philadelphia. And again, I like what you're saying. I agree with what you're saying. But I guess I'm looking for your thoughts on that kind of dichotomy between, yeah, this is right, this is good, and boy, oh boy. Because I'm also a doctor over at Temple, and I'm seeing people are coming in and dying left and right, aside from all the people reverse on the street and those that end up dying. So any thoughts?
Thank you for that question. That's a great question. I think a lot of people are struggling with that, and that's why it's really important to separate drug effects, prohibition effects, poverty, all of these things. And that's one of the reasons we've been allowed to continue this awful path, because we just lump it all together because people say, oh, drug addiction. When in fact you got people suffering for a variety of reasons, mental illness, poverty, just been shut out, having a hard time. I think about like what we're doing, like Philly, you guys have been trying to get supervised injection facilities and all of these sorts of things, and all of that is admirable. But the thing is, you can't get it twisted. The only people who are going to go to a supervised consumption facility are people without homes, people who don't have a place to go. Like I would never use in a spot like that, and most people won't. And so what you're really addressing is homelessness, but that's what we have to call it. But we call it drugs, and we say drugs, and that's the problem. And we lump everything we don't understand into our drug waste basket. And that's why we're in this mess. Because as I pointed out, in the book I tried to explain, I travel around the world, all of these well-to-do people who are doing far more drugs, even more drugs than the people that we see on our city streets. And they're fine. They're running the world. But we don't see that. Instead, we have surrendered. We've allowed people to scapegoat those people's drugs as those people's problems, when in fact there are other things that we should be attending to. So thank you for that question.
Hi.
Sorry.
Thank you. So I'm a counselor at an outpatient drug center in North Philly, and I'm writing my thesis. I'm trying to write it on harm reduction, and I know in your book you said that phrase is sort of not the best because it suggests inherent harm in drug use, and I'm kind of trying to figure out how to talk about harm reduction without suggesting that drug use is inherently harmful. And I was wondering if you had any more thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. So the thing I said about harm reduction in the book is that I was not talking about the practice of harm reduction, of course, because the practice is great. I was talking about the name. Like some less than thoughtful people thought I was criticizing the practice. My wife once said that it was like I was telling people stop calling Mary, stop referring to Mary as Ugly Mary. Like that's Ugly Mary. And then people look at me and say, why don't you like Ugly Mary? It's like, no, I'm trying to get you not to refer to her as Ugly Mary. But that's harm reduction. It's a loaded term. And it's only associated with drugs. And so when you pair drugs with harm, it shapes the way we think, it shapes the way we behave, and it shapes all of these things. So that's why I'm asking people, just describe what you're doing, just like we do in education. For example, I drove here, I put on a seatbelt. That's harm reduction, but I don't call it harm reduction. I brush my teeth, that's harm reduction, but I don't call it harm reduction. So I'm just asking people, just describe what you do. That's it, and just take away this sort of, the reason why that phrase became popular is because we were trying to satisfy folks who were ignorant and who thought that drugs only had this negative sort of connotation or negative effects were associated with drugs. And so I'm asking people just get away from the harm reduction, because people don't take drugs to reduce harm, take drugs to alter your consciousness, to feel positive, to feel a wide range of reasons, but not to reduce harm. So please just describe what you're doing. That's it.
Professor Hart, thank you so much for your talk. It was one of the best I've seen in years.
Thank you.
The framing of the problem of overdose and the problem of our criminalization of drug use requires your injection of the pleasure narrative into the discourse. So if the drug problem is a ruse to responsibilize the structural problems of poverty, trauma, racism, etc., onto the individual, to excuse society from having to fix the more expensive structural issues, and your framing is that we choose individual liberty and personal autonomy as the sort of rhetorical solution out of that trap. How do we move from a century of prohibition, of thinking that it's the domain of the state to dictate to the individual what it should do, and move towards this more beautiful, creative place where we can, flourish rather than living under the thumb of the state?
Wow, that's a great question. I got to tell you, God, damn, that's a big question. During the Trump presidency, and this is not to say anything about Trump's policy or anything like that, we just had leadership that allowed hate and divisiveness to fester, and it was okay to state these awful things about people that you don't like, and it became more prevalent, and it's still with us, of course. And so I, as a professor, 20-some-odd years, I had to step back, and as opposed to pointing the finger at somebody, like this person is, I pointed the finger at myself, and I thought, like, what role did I play in bringing us to this moment? So that's how, as a professor, because we have influence on students, we write, we speak, we do these public things. And so one of the things that, I concluded was that, I have to stand up for everyone. Like people in our society. I haven't stood up for every group. That's one. And I hadn't previously taught my students about the promise of the Declaration of Independence. I mean, we get this when we're 12 years old, when it doesn't apply to you because you're in your parents' house. You don't have any liberty and that sort of thing. And we don't really think about it anymore. And so one of the things that I do in my teaching, my students, they want to help people and they're enthusiastic. but they also may want to tell people how to live their life, because that's how young people who know a little something may do. And but there are people who are adults. They're older than our young students who have all this education, and they know better about their life than our young students may. And so I try and impress upon my students that your job is to not to tell people what to do, but to respect people's liberty and autonomy and that sort of thing. And I never emphasized that previously. And I think that's all of our jobs. And so that's a little thing that I'm trying to do in my teaching. I'm trying to show up for everyone, and trying not to vilify or castigate anyone, where in the past I may have been more careless about those things. And so I'm looking at myself. That's what I'm trying to do. But it's a difficult one, as you can tell by my answer. I'm struggling, but thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. It was excellent. Could you talk a little bit about drug experiences that cause severe stress, such as psychotic breaks? What's going on psychologically or neurologically with that?
Yeah, that's a broad question, you know. So one of the things we talk about, and I talk a little bit about this in the book, or what I talk about it in my writings, is this thing called set and setting. Are you familiar? So you think about the person, that's the set, and the setting, of course, is the environment under which drug use occurs. So if we think about somebody who might be predisposed to have a psychotic disorder because of some sort of family history, and then so that's an important sort of variable that we have to attend to. And then we can think about the setting. Think about something like cannabis. If you're taking cannabis in a state in which the drug is illegal and you're taking it near a police shop, and that can evoke a tremendous amount of paranoia that looks like a psychotic break at some level. So those things are critically important. And then when we think about the dose, we can think about someone who has little experience with a drug like cannabis or a large dose of an amphetamine, particularly a dopamine agonist. You can see some effect that look like paranoid schizophrenia if you take this large dose. That's why it's important for, in terms of our drug education, for people to understand things about dose, setting, also routes of administration. How is the drug being taken? Is it being taken intravenously and you're a newbie and you're dumping a tremendous amount of drug into your bloodstream? Not the best thing to do. All of these things are critically important. And so I try to talk a little bit about that in the book. I hope that helps.
Hey, thanks, Dr. Hart, for, this is great. Generally, a few of us are kind of like in the drug user harm reduction movement, and I was just wondering, just your perspective on like how do we move forward on this? I know harm reduction does seem to be like an incorrect term. I know I remember reading your book probably 5 years ago or maybe 6 years ago, and thinking to myself, you got to come out. You got to come out. Like the only way that you actually get the stigma around this to go is like if people are coming out, right? And I'm just like wondering, like from the organizing standpoint, all the information is there, but like nobody's going to make the right decision unless power is built and people come out, and and I just don't know how that will happen. I'm just wondering your views. We've seen in Canada and like Europe and stuff, there have been differing levels of thing, and queer communities. I just like mentioned queer communities because I'm just thinking about people have to come out. Like there's a weird like come out culture. They're constantly calling out to me, I don't know, who cares, right? Just like be yourself and fuck whoever you want, whatever. But like, I'm just saying, like, what are your views on that? Because we actually have to move forward. I heard you see these numbers on people that dehumanize people, just like, what's a way to like understand this thing? Like about like this like psychotic break. Like people, like how do we put the humanity in that space? Like I can say, like I'm use drugs, have like quote unquote a psychotic break. Why don't you just ask the people about what they thought about their psychotic break, quote unquote, you know, and if that really exists, you know. I'm just wondering, you know, because that I don't know. I don't really have that much to say, but I just wanted to at least think about like those like ways that you build power to actually like stop the harm and not just like talk it. Because it's really interesting, right? Somebody has a disease. In the Philippines, you have a disease. They commit a genocide against you, right? There's some lie here where people think that you have a disability and then people will take care of you. You know, that's ableism, but you know, it's just not the case. Anyway, go ahead. I'm done.
No. I'm trying to figure out where to get in because at some level you were saying how do we change the tide, or is that what I'm trying to figure out exactly?
Yeah. Just the idea of somebody admitting they have a substance use disorder, and then that's supposed to gain the the sympathy of people, to then have people treat them with dignity, is not. This is not the case. I don't know.
Well, so one of the things we do in our society, though, we have done a pretty good job with when people say, for example, acknowledge that they have a substance use problem, and then they denounce drugs. Now they are heroes in our society, and that's what that's one, those are like some of the few ways that you can come out in this society. You can say, I was once lost, now I found Jesus. That's our come to Jesus moment. That's okay. That's the only kind of way that is okay. And so you get a lot of people who are, that's the only way we've allowed them to come out, even though their problems had almost nothing to do with the drugs. But if they say drugs, then they are absolved of many of the responsibilities and the issues. And so it's the only way we've allowed people to come out. And that's wrong. And so, you can tell that annoys me. And so the important thing is that people need to understand that drug addiction almost has nothing to do with drugs. And so we have to look beyond drugs. And so if someone is telling you that it's the drug, then you are listening to somebody who's not being honest with you, or somebody who just hasn't been as thoughtful. Got microphones?
I got one. Thanks for your talk. I like going to a talk where I can, getting high beforehand is preparing for the talk. So
I don't know about that, man. Because, I wouldn't blow my high on a talk. I gotta tell you. That's not very smart, yo.
I like these. Now, so I wanted to hear a little bit more about alcohol. You said nothing about alcohol.
Yeah.
It's the main sort of problematic drug in this country, and it's associated with so many terrible things, yet it's legal, from gun violence to domestic violence to just, car accidents, etc. So your argument is that like the larger structural things are the bigger problem, but don't we see huge sort of problems with alcohol where those structural problems are less than here? In other words, looking internationally, comparatively, we see a lot of problems with alcohol, which is a drug. And even in countries where there is far less or little homelessness or these other background things. So how do you explain alcohol, which you didn't sort of say much about? Just wanted to hear about that.
I didn't say much about alcohol because Americans can go to the store and buy alcohol and enjoy their liberty with alcohol. That's why I didn't say much about alcohol. They're not going to jail for alcohol. That's why I didn't say much about alcohol. But I can talk about alcohol. I can talk about when we banned alcohol, why we banned alcohol. We banned alcohol in 1920 to 1933, in large part because of our hatred of Germans. It was near the war. Many Germans they owned a lot of the saloons. During alcohol prohibition, tens of thousands of Americans died because of tainted alcohol. They died or were maimed. When we overturned prohibition, those deaths dramatically dropped because we now have a quality control. We have a product that has quality control. Do people get in trouble with alcohol? Yeah, a small minority of people certainly get in trouble with alcohol. So we have to be better in terms of helping those people do better. I mean, young males largely, same people who get in trouble with a lot of the activities in your society. I mean, what do you want to say about alcohol?
Are there some drugs that are more problematic than others, or not at all?
Yeah, of course. Are there some drugs more problematic than others? We can think about, let's think about tobacco. Let's think about alcohol. Those are our legal drugs. Tobacco is associated with, 450,000 deaths a year. Not because of the major sort of psychoactive component, nicotine, but because of a lot of the additives and tar and a number of these other issues. And so we could have decreased a lot of this if we were more honest about our regulation of tobacco. But since we had this sort of screwed up policy in terms of making tobacco exempt from any sort of drug regulation, we weren't able to take out those horrible substances or control those horrible substances, the substances that people weren't necessarily seeking. And so if we're honest, we can do this better. And then when I think about alcohol is a special case because alcohol is the only drug, recreational drug that we have that we can take orally, and what's in the blood is like what's in the brain, like immediately, so the effects are felt immediately. There are no other drugs that we take recreationally like that. So alcohol is an ideal recreational drug. It's ideal. And so it has its special properties, and we try to reduce any sort of negative impact by controlling the unit dose, the route of administration that's available with alcohol. I mean, all of these kind of things that we treat these drugs special based on their pharmacological property. We would do the same thing with something like cocaine, the same thing with something like heroin, the same thing with something like MDMA. We would take our scientific knowledge and then apply that to the way we regulate it. Please.
Hi, Dr. Hart, thank you. Your work has always been an inspiration to me. I'm a lowly assistant professor. I study medical cannabis use for pediatric patients. And as an early career investigator, I need funding, and that funding comes from NIDA and NORA. And I'm wondering if you have any recommendations for the early career investigators looking to look at the benefits of drug use.
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the things that when you write your grants, there's always a problem that you can address. Obviously, and that will satisfy NIDA. But you don't stop there. You report everything you collect, including the beneficial effects. I mean, that's what many of us have done over the years. We wrote grants focusing on a problem. And so you would be expected to do the same. And so, but you just don't focus only on the negative effects and don't allow other people to do the same. But you have to get funding, I understand. Other microphone?
This concludes
Okay.
the question portion, so I'm going to hand it over to.
Only to say thank you so much, Dr. Hart. This was wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it.